1, 2, 3, 4. Welcome to Crazy Chester. Welcome to Crazy Chester. Crazy Chester's Radio Hour. Welcome to Crazy Chester. Welcome to Crazy Chester. Crazy Chester's Radio Hour. Yeah, Crazy Chester's Radio Hour. Crazy Chester's Radio Hour.
Welcome to the Crazy Chester Radio Hour. My name is Andreas Werner. I'm a record producer, songwriter, and owner of Crazy Chester Records. The theme song you just heard is performed by Wet Willie's Jimmy Hall and Funky Chester. Funky Chester is drummer Lynn Williams, who's played with Delbert McClinton, the Wallflowers, and the Muscle Shoals All-Stars. Paul Osola, who's been a member of Levon Helm's band and their Saturday Night Live band, and myself on guitar. Joe Funderburg recorded and mixed the track. The Crazy Chester Radio Hour is a weekly music talk podcast featuring an eclectic group of guests with musical hearts, minds, and souls. And many of the episodes will dive deep into the rich history of music mecca Muscle Shoals. We're taping this episode at Creative Workshop Recording Studio in Nashville, and today's guest is my good friend, music impresario Jon Tiven. Jon Tiven has been a record producer, songwriter, musician, sometime artist, and music journalist. Jon was born in Connecticut and lived in New York City for a long time before moving to Nashville about a dozen years ago. He's worked with B.B. King, Wilson Pickett, Frank Black, Steve Cropper, Don Covey, Bobby Womack, P.F. Sloan, Little Milton, and Hubert Sumlin, just to name a few, or at least a few of my favorites. His songs have been recorded by Huey Lewis and the News, B.B. King, Irma Thomas, Little Milton, Buddy Guy, Jeff Healey, and Robert Cray. Jon and I first met at the Paretta Soul Festival in Italy in 2007, and he was the first person in Nashville who invited me to his home to co-write a song with him. I'm glad to welcome him as my guest in the Crazy Chester Radio Hour. Hey, Jon, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, Andreas. So nice to see you.
Well, great to see you, and thanks for coming by.
Well, thanks for having me here as your second guest on the podcast. I hope there's many more to come.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Let's just jump right in and start at the beginning. How did you discover your love for music?
Well, my parents were big music fanatics always, so there was music in the house, which was great for me. And I remember playing piano in my basement with my mom by my side when I was about 4 years old. I played piano for a couple of years, and then I wanted to switch to another instrument because I thought piano was sort of boring. And I wanted to switch to guitar, but my parents sort of convinced me that I should go to saxophone, which was fine for a couple of years. And then in 1970, when I was 15 years old, I was playing baseball, and I was the catcher. And I wasn't wearing a mask. A bat came back, and 21 stitches later, I was a guitar player. I wasn't really able to play saxophone for about 30 years, but when I moved to Nashville in 2002, I decided I was going to attack the saxophone once again, so I bought a tenor, and I've really fallen in love with playing the saxophone, so it's been great for me to come back to that. But it's been a long journey, and there have been a lot of other instruments in between.
All right. So in your early teens, you also started writing about music. How did that come about?
I started initially writing for a science fiction fanzine called Grand Falloon. I wrote a review of 2001 A Space Odyssey, the film, which I saw on one of my first visits to New York. And I love the film, of course, and I wrote for this fanzine, and I thought, well, there need to be rock fanzines because people of my generation and people who aren't really that professional aren't writing about music. So I started my own magazine, I believe the next year, 1967. I called it the New Haven Rock Press, and we put out 5 issues a year for about 5 years. And I got to interview a lot of artists, and I got to meet people in the music industry and sort of educate myself as to what not only the music industry was all about, but what the life of people who lived in music and worked in music was really like. And that was very helpful to me because I got to figure out what I wanted to do at a very early age, because I got to see people who were doing it for real.
All right. You also put together a rock critic conference in Memphis. How did that come about?
Well, I didn't so much put it together. I helped. The guys who really put it together were the guys at Ardent Records. There was a guy named John King was the main guy, and they got Stax Records to fund the whole thing. So I helped them organize it to an extent, and I was instrumental, I guess, in getting the list of all the different critics who had come to the festival. And I also, once we were there was a group that Ardent had called Big Star that had broken up that I was very fond of, and Alex Chilton was doing a solo record, and I convinced him that it might be wise to perform as Big Star at this particular event, because we had all like 200-300 critics there at the time, and it would be a great opportunity for him to, launch whatever his next project was. At which point he decided he'd go into rehearsal quickly, and he and Jody and Andy, I guess, got Big Star back up on its feet, and later turned the recordings he had started as a solo project into a group project, and that became the Radio City record. So that was pretty great that I was able to get that in motion there. That was probably one of the best things that came out of that whole convention.
Yeah, and how did you transition from writing about music to be more hands-on involved in creating music?
Well, I had been doing demos in my basement and my friend's basement for some time. Since they came out with the TAC 4-track machines, we were able to make recordings that were fairly good simulations of a full rock band with just 2 of us. And I had a partner, Doug Snyder, who played everything that I didn't play, and didn't play guitar quite as well as a lead player as I did, so I added, and he could play drums and bass really well in addition to playing rhythm guitar. So we were a good combination. Our songs were a little obscure, but we sort of saw it through, and we were doing this. We almost got signed to first off, Andrew Oldham paid for us to go into the studio, and we did that, and we got Jody Stevens to play drums with us. That was in 1973 or 74, and then I think 73, and then later that year we got Mercury Records introduced to our music, and they really liked it, and they wanted to put us in the studio. And the guy who was interested was a guy named Paul Nelson, who's a music critic. And the week before we were set to go into the studio to make our recording for them, he got fired because they considered the New York Dolls to be a failure, and they had to fire somebody, and he was the guy. So that was the end of my career for the moment as a performing artist, because then I decided I was going to find something else to do, and Chess Records had offered me a job doing publicity and A&R out of the New York office. And they were going to pay me good money and give me an expense account. And so that started in early 1975. I moved to New York, and I was still playing music and trying to figure out what I was going to do with that. And Alex Chilton was calling me pretty frequently saying, I want to get back into the music industry. I'm not making records here that are going anywhere, that are getting released. Why don't you help me? So I tried to help him with what he was doing, and nobody was interested in that. So then he said, why don't you come down and produce me? So at that point, my job with Chess Records was a little tenuous, because they had moved out of their New York offices and I was working out of my apartment, which was very convenient for me because I could pretty much work whatever hours I wanted, and I was getting paid good money. I had an expense account, but then they wanted me to move to California, so they had me come to California for, I believe it was about a week, and I was talking to Alex during that time, and then we basically formalized the idea for me to come down and produce him. So in October of '75, September or October, I forget, it was I think late September, it might have been early October, I went down to Memphis and I produced Alex's debut record, which was fairly bold of me, and I didn't consider it any kind of success at the time because there were so many factors that came into play once I got down there that made it very it was a labored recording in a lot of respects. I mean, all recordings have a certain amount of labor, but Alex was not in great shape when I made that record, and it was sad to see him in that shape, and it was also it was tough to get the kind of performances that I had hoped I would be able to get out of him because he was not very healthy. So that was, was a sort of a very strange experience. I don't know to what extent he felt that he was as messed up as he was, but he had been in and out of the hospital a couple of times before that for quaaludes and stuff, and I think he knew that he had exhausted a lot of his opportunities in the music industry, and this might be his last shot that he'd get. So I think he was doing his best, but he had shot his wad to a certain extent, and doing melodic pop music, and he wanted to do something that was just more outrageous and arrogant, and I wanted to do a record that was a little more musical, and it wasn't the easiest record in the world to make, but it's been released like half a dozen times, and people like it, and I listen to it, and I hear some interesting things and things of beauty there, but it's also it was a tough experience personally to see someone who you admired like that in that state. It was just at age, I was 20 years old. Here's one of my idols, and he was in very tough shape. So anyway, that was my introduction to the music industry as a musician, as a producer.
But you also mentioned that there's been continued interest in the project, and actually just a couple months ago, a Munster record released a compilation of additional recordings and mixes from those same sessions.
Well, the one of the interesting things is that at that time, it was pretty apparent that any record I put out, the best thing I could do would be to make Alex sound as coherent and as appealing and as cheery as possible. And now in retrospect, a lot of his following likes to hear the stuff that's darker and grimmer and edgier, and that kind of music is now more in fashion, whereas back then not only was it not in fashion, it wasn't even heard of. So now the record is incredibly timely and shows the gestation of his artistry as the link between the more cheerful pop stuff he did in Big Star and to an extent in the Box Tops, and the more Lou Reed influenced stuff he did later. This shows where the jumping off point came, and it's sort of it's revelatory in a way that something that at the time was seen as such a departure and something that could not possibly further his career has become, such an integral part of his legacy and such an important record in his career.
Yeah. Earlier you mentioned Andrew Oldham, who previously had been the Rolling Stones manager. How did you get to meet him, and what's some of the stuff you worked on with him?
Andrew moved to Connecticut either 1969 or 1970. I think it's 1970. And there weren't a whole lot of other people involved in the Connecticut musical scene, so it was natural that we would meet. I actually initially met him as a journalist to interview him. I was supposed to interview him for Rolling Stone magazine, but once I finished the article, they weren't very interested because they're not interested in he had a feud with Jon Werner that neither one of them particularly got over. So the article was moot, but Andrew and I developed a friendship which has lasted to this day. We're still very, very friendly, part of which is because we rarely do business together because I don't think that would be necessarily good for our friendship, but we do like a lot of music together, and I've brought him a couple of artistic projects. I got him involved in doing a production of Big Star that never came out. He did a version of Mod Lang, went down to Memphis and produced them, and he and I were involved in trying to get things happening for Van Duren initially, although he sort of became less involved in that. And then I brought him a group called the Werewolves, which I produced the demos to with him, and then some of them got used on the album and some of them not. And he had me play on a Rolling Stones session in 1975. That was my first session playing on a record. I walked into, he said, I was working at Chess Records at the time. He said, "John, come over after work. I've got a little something happening I think you might enjoy." He was at the record plant. So I walk into the record plant, and it's Andrew and an artist he was working with, Brett Smiley at the time. They were just hanging out, and I hear the Rolling Stones playing over the speakers. I said, "Andrew, this is great. This is wonderful." He said, "Come on." He shows me to a setup where there are congas, and he takes my briefcase from me and he sets it up. He mics my briefcase. He plays my briefcase, and I play the congas. And there were two songs, "Jivin' Sister Fanny" and "I'm Going Down," and that was my first recorded experience in the music business, and that's pretty great.
And those were overdubs for the Metamorphosis album?
Yeah, the Metamorphosis record, which was out later that year, 1975.
Yeah.
So it was a big year for me. I had the Metamorphosis record. I played on a Major Lance record when I was making the Alex Chilton record. I've Got a Right to Cry, which is actually I played on the B side. You Keep Me Coming to You, which is a Betty Crutcher song. And that also came out in 75. So here I was in the music business. I had records out by Major Lance and the Rolling Stones. I was happening, baby. I had just finished producing Alex Chilton. I hadn't found the deal on it yet. But, that would come.
Yeah, and it was not necessarily work that you would get credited for either on the record release.
Well, I was just happy to be working. I didn't really think that anybody would, you mean we get paid for doing this too? Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah.
And then just a little later, you started a group called Prix, Prix. How did that project come about?
Well, Prix was, I moved down to Memphis after I did the Alex Chilton thing. I went back to New York, tried to sell the Alex Chilton record, and there were no takers. And then I went back to school for about a week. I went to back to Yale for a week, and that wasn't taken. And I said, I got to do something else. So I moved to Memphis. in 1976, and I stayed there for about 6 months. I was originally I was in a group with Van Duren, Chris Bell, Jody Stevens, and a guy named Mike Brignardello. And
Bass player. He lives in Nashville here.
And we didn't have a whole lot of gigs, but it was great talent in the band. It was great people. But I felt pretty superfluous after a couple of gigs. And so I left to produce a guy named Tommy Hohen. And as we were doing the project, it was him and me and a guy named Chris Bell, who had been in this group and who also was in Big Star. And Chris was producing with me, and Tommy was the artist, and then Tommy decided he wanted me to be the artist with him. So that became Pre. And we never played a single gig. We played one showcase gig for Columbia Records later that year or early the next year. I'm not sure which. I can't remember dates. And we managed to we had a record deal with Mercury that was on the second draft of the contract, and then somebody at the label decided that was not a good investment for them. So this was my second time striking out with Mercury. Then Columbia put us in the studio, and we did the one night in the studio with them, and they offered us a deal, but it was contingent upon us doing one cover song, which I was fine with. And I called my singer, Tommy, to see what he thought, and he had split town already. He had a solo deal happening that wasn't going to include me, and that he would, be able to control 100%. So I was left with these tapes that we had done together, and so I managed to find a record label to put them out, which was amazing. And they also put out the Chilton stuff, so it was back on the boards. Good project. Couldn't die in my hands.
Yeah, and there were some more productions you did for Orc Records too.
Well, the only other one that I did that came out was the McFerrin record, and that was pretty wild. That was with my old partner Doug Snyder on bass and rhythm guitar, and Mark Bell, otherwise known as Marky Ramone, on drums, and that was like a month before he joined the Ramones. He was getting phone calls from the Ramones as he was in the studio with us, telling him that he had gotten the gig replacing Tommy, which is pretty wild at the time, feeling like you got a part of history happening. And McFerrin was semi-legendary, a pretty incredible guy, and just really drunk out of his gourd, and thought the whole session was a complete disaster until he heard the results, and then he thought it was brilliant. And he writes about it in his book. So I was happy that he was happy with the work.
Yeah. So how did you move from there to the Yankees?
Well, what happened was I had a disagreement with the Orc Records people because I thought I should be getting paid for my work, and I didn't like the fact that they were spelling my name wrong on the releases, and I just didn't. There was a guy working for them who I didn't really get along with, so I left to form a record company with a guy who was even worse. But that's the music business, you a lot of people go through a succession of bad partners and find out that they have to just do it alone, and that was my experience. So the Yankees was part of the thing with this bad partner and Big Sound Records, and I pretty much figured I was through with being an artist after the Yankees, because dealing with him really left a sour taste in my mouth, aside from the fact that I'm much happier playing than singing. But I got back to it later on with a good partner, Steve Koenich. So
yeah, tell us a little bit though, who were your partners in the Yankees? Because some of them later had to quite interesting career.
Oh yeah, well, the main record was done with myself and Mickey Curry, who's a fantastic drummer who plays with Bryan Adams now, and I just heard from him 2 days ago. And Paul Asola was the bass player on a lot of the tracks. Who has done a lot of sessions and now lives here in Nashville. A guy named Ivan Julian, who was in Richard Hell and the Voidoids and since has done other groups like I think the Fauntleroys and his own solo projects. There's a guy named Hilly Michaels who had a solo career on Warner Brothers. And, of course, my wife, Sally Tiven, who married me after the record came out, I believe.
Yeah, she's still credited as Sally Young on the record sleeve, so that must be right. Yeah. And you've been collaborating with Sally on a lot of your work, too. She's been a frequent co-writer and bass player on many of your productions. How is it being able to not just share your life with such a wonderful person, but being able to collaborate on a musical level, too?
Well, it's really great because, you skip through a lot of steps that you ordinarily would have to go through with a person when you know them as well as Sally and I know each other. So, she can listen to something that I get started and say, I think you got this. I don't want to work on this because you got it. And then sometimes she'll say, okay, I want to play on that. So it's good, and it's nice to have peace in the home and everybody working.
Yeah, and you got a beautiful daughter out of it too, which is pretty.
We got a beautiful daughter and a great dog and pretty good life for somebody who doesn't, crave the limelight.
All right. Well, moving on from the Yankees, there's a story I love, and it's kind of interesting. The stuff like that happens to a friend of mine, but it's always great to hear those stories. But how did you become John Belushi's guitar teacher?
Okay, I gotta tell about that entire day. The day that I met John Belushi was the day that I auditioned to be the guitar player in the Jim Carroll Band, which was my favorite group in the world. I loved their whole album. People Who Died was just a great record, and they had just lost their two guitar players because their producer and manager, Earl McGrath, didn't want to give them points on the record, so they split. So they had this vacancy, and somebody, a bass playing friend of mine, Brian Stanley, who I had gotten the gig in the G.E. Smith Band, said, you should check out the Jim Carroll Band. They're looking for a guitar player. So I said, thank you very much, Brian, and I checked it out. I got called into audition, and it was myself with their band. I don't think Jim was there until the very end, and there was another guitarist there to ostensibly play rhythm guitar while I played leads and stuff like that. The other guitarist was Ray Gomez, who is a mother of a guitar player, a great guy, great player, and by no means a rhythm guitar player. So it was a lot of, I was trying to play the rhythm guitar parts, and they were throwing new song ideas at me, and I was trying to flesh them out into full songs. So it was a great opportunity. So I aced the rehearsal. It was very easy. So I left the rehearsal with my guitar on my back, walked to my gym, put my guitar in my locker, and put my bathing suit on and went down to the jacuzzi, sat in the jacuzzi, closed my eyes, and when I opened my eyes, across from me was sitting Farrah Fawcett. And I was like, this is my lucky day. Here I am. I just aced the audition with the Jim Carroll Band, and Farrah Fawcett is sitting across from me. She says to me, hey, how you doing? Like she knew me, and she was as friendly as can be. I felt like, okay, the angels are with me today. That night, I took my wife to see David Lindley play at the Bottom Line. And I'm sitting in my seat, and these two journalists, Mitch Glazer and Timothy White from Rolling Stone and Billboard come over to me and say, "Aren't you Jon Tiven from the Yankees?" I said, "Yeah, I am." They said, "Oh, we love your record, and why don't you come with us to this party after the show?" I said, "I'm not really a party guy, but what do you have in mind?" "Well, it's a rap party for the film Neighbors with Dan Aykroyd and John Belushi." I'm like, "Sure, I'm there. That sounds like fun." So we go to the blues bar, and Mitch and Tim take me straight up to see John, and the party's just getting started, and John says, "The guitar player's not here. Can you play guitar to me?" I said, "Yeah, what do you need?" He says, "A bunch of blues songs and some Chuck Berry stuff." I'm like, "Oh, yeah, I got that." So I jump up on the stage. I'm introduced to the rest of the band, which is the rhythm section for ZZ Top. So we start doing Jailhouse Rock and Baby What You Want Me to Do and stuff like that, and we're rocking. I'm totally feeling out of my league, but I'm comping as best I can. And then Billy Gibbons shows up, and I hand him the guitar. I say, "Man, this is your band. You take over. You know what to do with this thing." So I was loving it, enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed playing it. And then afterwards, John came up to me and said, "Oh, I love the way you play guitar. Who do you play with?" And I said, "Well, it looks like I'm going to be playing with the Jim Carroll Band. I just auditioned for them today." And he said, "That's my favorite record of the year. I want you to teach me guitar." I said, "Okay, let's go." So I started teaching John how to play guitar, and we became really good friends. And the last time I saw John Belushi was at the Lone Star Cafe. We played a gig with Peter Aykroyd's band, the Mini 14s, as the backing band. And we had a lovely time, and it was, I think, January 81, I think, the year he passed. That was it. It was around my birthday, which is January 3rd.
Yeah, well, and you ended up playing with the Jim Carroll Band for a while. Can you tell us a little bit about...
Oh, I was in the Jim Carroll Band for a year, and it was a fantastic experience because I loved Jim Carroll, and I loved his music, and he was just a fantastic guy to be around and just brilliant. I didn't get along quite so well. I didn't not get along terribly, but everybody else in the band was like a smoker for starters, which was tough in the van because we were going on these 7-8 hour drives in a van, and I was the only guy who didn't smoke cigarettes in the van. And then we get to the gig, and we didn't have the similar lifestyles. I was a happily married guy and didn't really go for the big partying scene, and they had a different outlook on life, and there wasn't much socially between me and the rest of the guys in the band except Jim. Jim and I got along tremendously. So I felt like I was the odd man out. And then we did a big tour of Canada, and all of a sudden in this Canadian tour, I was like, fuck it, I'm just going to go out there and rock like it's nobody's business and leave this thing after the tour and just, show them what I could do. So I did that, and at the last gig, their manager, Earl McGrath, came up to me and said, "John, we really, we've been riding your ass for 6 months, but, we really, so impressed with what you've done on this tour and stuff like that." I said, "We'll talk about this when we get back to New York, okay?" So when I got back to New York, I said, "Look, I can't continue in this situation. It's just not furthering my idea of what I should be doing with my life." So I left the band with no real safety net, nothing else. I just didn't want to become a road rat. And in fact, 2 weeks after that, the van got into an accident on the road, and a couple of guys got knocked up, and I was like, oh, well, I'm glad I dodged that bullet. But I never really went out on the road again to that extent. Though I was in a band with Al Franken and Tom Davis, and we did some dates. They weren't van dates. They were fly-ins, which is much preferable.
Yeah. And up to that point, you were mainly involved with like rock and roll type of music, but then you started transitioning to working with a lot of R&B, soul, and blues performers, and you were also asked to produce some tribute albums. How did all of that come about?
Well, what happened was the genesis was I went to a party at Steve Jordan's house, and I believe this was 1985, 84, 85, around then. And I ran into Don Covey, who I had met earlier in my time as a rock journalist, because he was working for Mercury Records in A&R. And we caught up, and I told him I was, I'd since then, I had, since I left the Jim Carroll Band, I had done some publishing deals with my songs, and gotten a couple people to cover my tunes, and had some songs in some films and stuff like that. So that was good for the head, good for the career. And I told Don that was what I was up to, and he was very interested in getting together and writing, because he had just been dealing with his wife's death and hadn't really been doing anything musical except for singing background on the Rolling Stones record, Dirty Work. And so we got together a couple of times a week, every week, for months, putting together repertoire and getting songs together for him and for other people. And eventually first we had almost got cut by Tina Turner, but then Huey Lewis cut He Don't Know What to Do for You, which was a medium hit here, a sizable hit elsewhere. And that really was great in another respect, because then Chris Blackwell came in and wanted to do a record with Don Covey, and we were involved in doing that. And Don introduced us to Bobby Womack, and things started moving towards a career in rhythm and blues, which was great. I got to produce B.B. King through getting a song of mine recorded by Jeff Healey that did extremely well. And one thing was leading to another. I had an old friend named Mac Rice, who I produced a record by, which should have done better than it did, because it was a wonderful record, and he's a great writer, but it only got to a certain level. But one of the byproducts of me doing that record was he wanted me to send a copy of the record to his friend Wilson Pickett, so I did that. And a week later, I got a call from Wilson Pickett saying, I want to make a record with you, which was one of the big breakthrough moments in my career, to be able to make a record with one of the greatest singers of all time and really helm the project, write every song either with him or with friends of mine. And when it was time to, take the bows for that record, it was very nice, because I was, it was just me and Wilson on that record, really, so it was a fantastic experience, and it let everybody know what I was capable of doing. So that was great. That was a momentous occasion.
And how did you get asked to produce some tribute albums?
The tribute records
several of those.
That was an interesting story. I was trying to get Arthur Alexander a record deal, and I had brought him out of retirement, and we had done a gig at the Bottom Line, written some songs together, and I'd brought a couple of labels out to see Arthur, one of which was Shanachie. And Shanachie were really taken with Arthur and really wanted to make a record with him in the worst way, but Elektra outbid him, and Elektra gave me the elbow and paid me $3,000 to go away, and made the record using all the songs that I had chosen for the record, all the musicians that I'd chosen, but with a different producer. So I was a little bummed about that, but the Shanachie people really had great respect for the work that I had done, and they were trying to do a tribute record with Curtis Mayfield, but hadn't figured out a way to do it. And so they came to me and said, Jon, we know you did that one tribute record to Phil Spector, which I had done back when I was working with Big Sound, the Bionic Gold record. Would you be interested in doing a tribute record to Curtis Mayfield? And it just clicked for me how it should be done. And I said, well, yeah, sure. We'll get Steve Cropper and Paul Griffin. And I know a couple of younger cats we can get in there as well. And then we'll get all the band tracks together, cut them in, 2 days, and then we'll get the singers in. And that was the closest anybody had come to them to really giving them a plan on how to do the tribute record. So they got me together with Joe Ferry, who was the producer on the record, and they said, can you guys work together? And I met Joe, and he was a lovely guy, and so we did the record together. And it did really well, and so we said, can we do another? Because my friend Don Covey has just had a stroke and gone into the hospital. It'd be nice to do a tribute to him. They said, we love Don and his song. So we did that record, and, a fantastic cast of characters on that record with Robert Cray and Ron Wood, Bobby Womack, introducing the world to Ruthie Foster. It was, a spectacular record. So that was good, but Joe broke his leg in the middle of that record, and he wasn't really that engaged in the process. So when it came time to do the next record, they figured, well, since you did the last record pretty much, most of it without Joe, do you want to, would you be interested in bringing in someone else to do the next record with, another tribute record with? I said, yeah, I'd like to do an Otis Blackwell tribute record, and I'd like to do it with Tony Visconti. I knew Tony through his wife, May Pang, at the time. And we got along really well, so we did that record, which was, again, unbelievable cast of characters. Frank Black, this is the first time where I got to work with Frank Black from the Pixies, as well as Graham Parker and Chrissy Hind, and it's just, A to Z of rock at the time, rock people like, Tom Verlaine and Debbie Harry. Is fantastic record. So then I finished that, and I sort of felt like I had sort of played my last hand at Shanachie, because the Otis Blackwell record didn't do nearly as well as the Don Covey or the Curtis Mayfield, even though I thought it was every bit as good a record, even maybe better, but I think it was sort of outside of their usual field of expertise, which is more in a jazz, R&B, blues, groove audience. They didn't really know how to sell records to the rock audience. And I had done a reissue of my Alex Chilton record with a label called Razor and Tie, so I figured I could approach them on a tribute record. So I approached them, and we did the Arthur Alexander tribute record with everyone from Robert Plant and Roger McGuinn to Mark Knopfler, and again, I had some of my favorites like Graham Parker, and I brought in Gary U.S. Bonds. It was, it's a wonderful series of records to have done.
Absolutely. And one more you did as a tribute to Van Morrison. Would you mind sharing a few stories about that too?
All right. Well, I was approached in 2000. I think it was 2000. It might have been 1999. To the people who had bought the Blacktop label, which was eMusic, wanted me to run Blacktop Records. I said, no, thank you. But if you want me to produce records for you, give me a production company. I'd be more than happy to produce a series of records for you. So they they said, sure, why don't you do 7 records for us over a 2-year period, and we'll give you $35,000 to make each record. I said, that sounds great. That's a wonderful way to spend the next 2 years. I wasn't going to see that $35,000 included the budget for the record and the advance to the artist and stuff like that. But, I would get, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of $8,000 for each record, which is really great, pretty wonderful. So they first approached me about doing a tribute record to Johnny Taylor, who had recently passed. And I love Johnny Taylor, but I just didn't think a tribute to Johnny Taylor would be that interesting a record. But I said, okay, I'd be happy to do that. Tell me, who do I talk to? How do I get this started? They said, well, his best friend is this guy, Bobby Patterson. So why don't you talk to Bobby Patterson? And but give us a week to talk to the family. I said, fine. So a week later, I get the call from eMusic. They said, well, that Johnny Taylor record isn't going to happen because the family thinks it's too soon. I said, that's a shame. They said, but we still want you to do a tribute record. So is there anybody you want to do a tribute to? And I thought for about 10 seconds. I said, why don't we do a record of R&B artists covering Van Morrison songs? And they thought for about the same 5 seconds and said, that's a great idea. So I put together this all-star band, which was Simon Kirke on drums, Henry Butler on keyboards, and my wife and myself on guitar and bass. Paul Solo played bass on one track, played stand-up. And we tracked the whole thing. I think it might have been 3 days, but it might have just been 2. I can't remember. And then got everyone from Betty LaVette, who at that time was not particularly well known. She hadn't done any kind of comeback records yet. This is like her first release on a major label in 17 years, I think. And we had Eddie Floyd and Syl Johnson, just a great cast of characters. And the record, I was very, very happy with the record, but eMusic went through some business problems, so it didn't get to come out for another couple of years, but it was a wonderful record to be associated with. And Van and his crew have enjoyed it immensely, from what I've told. Their favorite track was the Betty LaVette track.
Yeah, and leading up to that, you also did 2 albums kind of under your own name. One is Jon Tiven Ego Trip, and the other one is Jon Tiven Group.
Yeah, I did those. The first one, each of those records was done for a record label. The first one was done for, I believe, Buy or Die Records initially. And as we got further and further into the record, they became more difficult to extract the funds necessary to continue the record. So at one point I said, well, what do you want to do? I can't get money out of you to finish the record. I can't make a record without a budget. And they said, well, do you want to be cut loose? I said, yeah. So they cut me loose, let me keep what they had paid for already. So I went to another label, Fountain Blue. Then when I went to make the second record was made for like Lucky 7 Records, and then they did a similar thing right in the 11th hour, and so we ended up on New West Records. And neither one of those was they were reasonably fun records to make, but I don't like being the artist that much. I don't like being the center of gravity for a record. So I don't have really wonderful memories of the gigs associated with those. Were not as well attended as one would like, because we had no promotion from the label. The only really memorable gig was we played Sylvia's in Harlem once, and that was a wonderful gig, but we got shorted on the money by our promoter, who was this guy Sparky Martin, and he, I was trying to pay everybody in the band a reasonable amount of money, and he came up, I think he paid us half of what we were supposed to get. And so every time after I saw him, I was like, Sparky, you're looking so tall. And he looked at me, like with wonder when I said that. And I kept saying, finally he said, why do you keep saying that I look so tall? I said, because that night in Sylvia's, you were very short. And he sort of laughed, and then he walked away. So that was my last dealings with Sparky Martin. And pretty much my last dealings with the group per se, because I'd rather work on other people's projects than work on my own. It's I'm not really a live musician, and that I don't live that lifestyle. I don't live for it. I enjoy playing when I get on a stage, but I don't enjoy the travel. I don't enjoy the bad meals that are inevitably part of it. I like it when I'm treated really well in a gig, as anybody would like it, but I'm not a youngster anymore. I don't want to suffer from my music. I want to enjoy my life.
Yeah, but I believe shortly after that you met Ellis Hooks, and you did half a dozen albums with him over, leading up to now. How did that collaboration come about?
Ellis, bunch of friends of mine took me out to a gentleman's club on I forget which birthday it was, but it was my birthday. It was a momentous birthday. And so this, one of the girls came up and asked us for a dance, and she looked at me and my friends. She said, "Are you in the music business?" And we said, "Yeah." And she said, "Oh, I used to be in that business, but too sleazy." So we thought that was pretty funny. And she did a dance, and she asked if she could play her music for me. I said, sure. So I gave her my card, and she called me up, said, "Can I come over? Play my music?" I said, sure. And so she came over, and she brought her friend with her. I guess she didn't want to be in an apartment with a strange man who she had shown off her breasts to, and who could blame her for that? So she played me her music, and it wasn't really my kind of music. It was it's just not my style at all. And then I took a look at her friend and said, "So what do you do?" He says, "I sing." I said, "Oh, okay, what kind of music?" And he grabs my guitar off the wall and starts singing. And I heard a voice that I really liked. And this was just as things were starting off with me for eMusic. A couple months later, I pulled in Ellis and I said, let's try to do something and make something happen. And so I got him a reasonable budget and an advance, and we were off and running. We made a couple records for eMusic. Unfortunately, eMusic went under before we were able to really make the most of that situation, but we managed to pull ourselves out of it and do well. So that was great. And Ellis is a wonderful artist and a really a great guy, and I wish him the best with his he's got a record out with Chris Bergson now that's really good, so everybody should listen to that.
Yeah, and then 9/11 happened, which was one of the reasons why you decided to leave New York, if I'm right. So how did you set your eyes on Nashville, and how did that move happen?
Well, I had to figure out where to move, because I wasn't necessarily set on Nashville. So I called my friends, and Marshall Crenshaw told me that I wasn't going to find much of a musical scene in Woodstock. So the Woodstock dream was over, and the weather was crappy. And then I called my friends in California, and I deduced that as I didn't drive, it was going to be a nightmare for me to move out there. And London didn't seem likely. So I called my friends in Nashville. And they said, oh, yeah, you'll be welcome to the musical community here, and it should be great. I'd made a couple of records in Nashville, and I liked it a lot. I never really thought about moving there when I visited. But when push came to shove, I decided, well, I know the weather's going to be at least a little bit warmer, and I got some good friends there, and looks like I can get a really nice house in Nashville for about 2/3 of what I sell my New York apartment for. So family and I packed our stuff up, and we moved down to Nashville and made a good life for us here. I've grown to really enjoy it.
Yeah, and I think around the same time you started working more with Frank Black, and you've done a handful of albums with him since. Can you tell us a little bit about that collaboration?
Well, we had worked on some tribute records, and I had produced an EP by him, or a maxi single, whatever, to go with the Headache record. And we always got along really well, and he kept talking about wanting to make a record called Black on Blonde, I think was his original thing, because he wanted to do like a blonde on blonde type record, except, basically using the Nashville Cats to interpret his songs in a way that was different from what people were used to with the Pixies or his solo work. And I said, I know all the Cats, and it'd be a lot of fun to do. And he called me and he said, look, I'm going to do a Pixies reunion, but I want to do this record. So we did the Honeycomb record, and that was with, the greatest musicians. It was a wonderful assortment we had Reggie Young and Steve Cropper, and Buddy Miller on guitars. We had David Hood on bass, Spooner Oldham on keys. We had Chester Thompson, his son Emil, and Billy Block, and Anton Fig on drums. Am I forgetting anybody? I think that's everybody. Oh, and Jimmy Griffin from Bread on backing vocals. It's just a wonderful time, just like 5 days of recording. And then, a year later, maybe not even, he says, look, I've got a gig in Nashville, and then I've got a day layover before I have to be in Tampa. Can we do a record? I said, yeah. And I called Dan Penn to see if we can get back in his studio, and he said, I can't give you the time. I'm doing another project here. He's doing the Bobby Purify record. So I called my friend Cowboy Jack Clement. I said, I've got a crazy record I want to do in your studio. We're going to be in your studio for about 36 hours. We're going to do a whole album in 36 hours with a great assortment of musicians. You up for it? Jack said, count me in. So he lorded over the sessions, cooking us refried donuts and rolling joints, and it was Levon Helm, Simon Kirk, Billy Block, Bob Babbitt on bass, Ian McLagan and Mark Jordan on keyboards, Buddy Miller, Lyle Workman, Steve Cropper on guitars, Wayne Jackson on trumpet. I'm probably forgetting somebody, but it was just an amazing marathon. Oh, Tom Peterson came in and played bass on one song. It's just a marathon session where we did the entire record inside of pretty much a day. They played the show. The Pixies played the show in Nashville. We went straight over to the studio afterwards, started cutting. We cut for about 6 hours. Then I sent the first band home. I brought in another band. Whoever hadn't played on the first bunch of tracks came in. I tracked with them for 6 hours. They then sent them home to sleep and brought the first band back in. And then we did the whole thing all over again. And we got like a dozen songs with virtually all the instruments done, all pretty much live in the studio over a course of a day. And then did some other recording sessions to make it into a double record. So, yeah, and then we did a record with Frank Black, whatever, and Reed Paley as a duo in my house with David Hood and Spooner Oldham and a drummer or two. Harry Stinson played on a lot of it in my house. Basically did the whole record in my back room. And that was just a couple of years ago. So yeah, I've had a lot of Frank Black. I've done probably 20 records in my house since I moved to Nashville, maybe 25.
Yeah, and in between you also did a Steve Cropper album that was a tribute to the Five Royals that you did at Dan Penn Studio.
Right. I did also a Steve Cropper and Felix Cavalieri record in my house mostly for Concord Records. And what else? No, lots
I
of
love the Little Milton album.
Little Milton. I did Garnett Mims, Betty Harris. The record I did with Billy Ray Martin in 2000 or 1999, after just sitting on the shelf for 16, 17 years, she decided she wanted to finish it. So that came out last year and went top 10 on the dance charts, which was nice. And now I'm making a record with Handsome Dick Manitoba of the Dictators and also of Sirius Radio, making a soul punk record.
Yeah, and we're getting to the end of this, but we cannot not talk about one of the most interesting individuals I've ever met, and one of your probably most frequent collaborator in your whole career, and just a great guy on top of that. And I'm talking about poet and lyricist Stephen Kilinich, who has before collaborated with the Beach Boys, especially Brian and Dennis Wilson. And
he wrote the lyrics to the Paul McCartney Brian Wilson duet, Friend Like You.
Absolutely. And he did actually an album with Brian Wilson producing too that just came out recently, although it was recorded in the late 60s, I believe. But I believe you met him through P.F. Sloan.
Yeah, P.F. Sloan, whose record I produced in, I think, 2005, 2006. He said, would you be interested in writing with a friend of mine who's written with the Beach Boys and Brian a lot? He's not as famous as Van Dyke Parks, but he's really great and really interesting character. I said, sure, what's his name? He said, Stephen Kilinich. I said, oh, the household name. And he laughed, and I said, okay, yeah, put us together. So we got to be friendly over the phone, and then we went, he and P.F. Sloan and I all went to India together in 2006, and Stevie and I wrote our first song in India at the ashram of Sai Baba in Put a Party. And then I guess a year or two later, he calls me and he says, because I had sent him a demo of the song that I did. He says, that song that we did, Everything's Exploding, I want to put it on my record. I've got a record coming out. I said, great. Who's going to sing it? Because he always has like somebody associated with the Beach Boys, either their sons or daughters, or David Marks did a couple, or Al Jardine. I was like, oh, great, he's going to get Al Jardine to sing the song. He says, no, I want you to sing it. I'm like, oh, into this again. So I said, okay, what do you want me to do? he said, send the tracks to Mark Lynette, and he'll mix it. Now, I felt really good about that because Mark Lynette is a genius. He's a really phenomenal audio engineer, mixer, everything. And so I sent the tracks, and I really liked what he did with them. Basically turned them inside out. And so Stevie was really enthused by that and the reaction to that. So it turned into, we made a whole record together as a duo, I guess 2011. And then we did another one a couple years later. And we write all the time, and we have a new record coming out, I think in November of this year, Stevie's solo record, which has duets with Frank Black and Becca Bramlett, Dylan LeBlanc, Tara Holloway, and it's a wonderful record. It's called Scrambled Eggs.
All right. Well, let's leave it at that. I know you always have a lot of stuff going on. I look forward to hearing the Handsome Dick album.
I think you'll really enjoy it. We did a version of Eve Destruction, which P.F. Sloan wrote, and we've got quite an assortment of. We've got Shannon Pollard on drums, who's Eddie Arnold's grandson. We've got Buddy Miller and myself on guitar and mandocello, and P.F. Sloan from The Great Beyond is playing harmonica, acoustic guitar, and backing vocals. Chuck Mead singing on it. It's a fantastic version, really powerful. So I think you'll like that a lot.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being my guest today and sharing all these wonderful stories. And I look forward to whatever lies ahead.
Well, thanks for having me, and best of luck with the podcast. And I hope all the people in the audience just do everything they can to let their friends know about this, because it's a real good thing that he's doing. Andreas has made a wonderful career for himself here in Nashville as a music creator and fan and aficionado, and anything that helps that go further is a good thing.
Thank you so much. This was the second episode of the Crazy Chester Radio Hour. Special thanks to Creative Workshop Recording Studio for hosting us today, and Joe Funderburg for his technical assistance. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. See you next week.